Hey friends, it's Simon Hurley and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be sharing my brand new release and a couple different creative ways to use your stencils to get really beautiful results. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so I'm starting off with the Grand Greenery stencil. I love the different details in the stencil and the botanicals, and I'm going to pull this out and show you guys how to add a little bit of texture to your stenciled project. So I'm going to go in with my Spellbinders Platinum machine, and these usually come along with this rubber mat, which is great for embossing with different products. I'm going to place down the mat right on top of my platform, place down a piece of cardstock, and then my stencil over top, as well as the blue embossing plate, which also usually comes along with the machine. Then I'm going to run this right through my die cutting machine, and it's going to give me a beautiful embossed impression on my cardstock. So using stencils is just one way to do this. You can do it with dies for a soft impression as well, but I just love the little bit of soft texture that adds to the background. It's a great way to get a little bit more use out of your stencils. I think it's so beautiful. So a little way to step this up, I'm going to take the stick and stamp mat from Brutus Monroe just to kind of adhere it down so that it doesn't move while I'm doing my stenciling, and then I can start my blending. Now I'm using a light blue color here called Breakup Blue, and with these blending brushes I use one for each color family, so I'm just making sure to wipe it off to the side so that it's just light enough for my color. Then I can take that same Grand Greenery stencil and I'm going to shift it just a little bit. Here I'm shifting it so that the botanicals kind of go in between the ones that are already embossed on our cardstock. Then I'm going to place it on the stick and stamp mat, which kind of sticks it down, and I'll go in and do my blending with this light ink color. Then as I go throughout, I'm going to continue moving the stencil so that it kind of goes in between each one. I moved it about 3 different times just to make sure that the placement of these botanicals was exactly where I want them, but you can totally move and shift your stencil around to do little pieces and parts of it wherever it fits into your project. So don't be afraid to kind of move things and not just keep it tacked down into one place. So once I've kind of blended all those pieces down, I'm going to lift off the stencil and then just blend a little bit of that breakup blue color all around the edge. I like to do this just to kind of make it a little bit less stark white, and also by adding darkness to the edge, you're lightening up the center, and that's where a focal point is going to be, so it'll kind of draw your eyes to that. It's a technique I like to use a lot to kind of bring your eyes to the focal point. Then to clean off the stick and stamp mat, I'm just going to spray it down with a little bit of water, and then you can go in with a lint-free cloth like a paper towel to easily wipe off the inks since they're just water-based. I love the stick and stamp mat because once the water evaporates off, it becomes sticky again. This might be out of stock, but I'll link down kind of similar sticky mats in the description box, and then I replace the piece of acetate when I'm ready to store it. Moving on to the next stenciling technique and the focal point for my card, I'm going to use the pretty Peonies stamp set. I love that the stamp set has those elegant line flowers and the bold stamps to fill them in and color them. I'm going to go in and use one of the lined images of the flower kind of opening up and blooming, and I'll stamp that down using a little bit of black ink, and then I'll heat emboss this with a little bit of clear heat embossing powder. This is because we're going to be doing a little bit of watercoloring, and when you heat this, it kind of builds a plastic barrier, which is going to create almost like a wall for a watercolor so it won't bleed out. I really love to do that. So then I'm going to create a palette of my inks on my craft sheet, just taking the ink pads that I'm going to use to color and smooshing them down onto the surface. This is going to create a nice palette of color that I can lift from and color in the image with. I use a couple different greens, orange, and pink that I'm going to color the flower with. Now whenever I'm watercoloring, I like to use a regular paintbrush because I find I can control my water a little bit more. And then I go in for the first layer with a layer of just plain water. This prepares the cardstock for the ink, and instead of sinking right into the surface, it allows it to blend a little bit more since the surface is already wet. You can see here when I'm adding down the pink, I can kind of move around that color before it sinks in completely, and it allows for me to blend the colors together. So here I'm quickly going in with a little bit of orange, and you can see those colors blend and meld perfectly because of the first layer of water that we added. I find that when people are struggling with watercolor, sometimes that's the main thing, is you just need a little bit more water to start out with, and that'll blend everything together. So I blended those colors together, and then I'm going to go in with the leaves and do the same thing, adding a little bit of water and then my light green layer. Now when I'm done with the lightest color, I go in with a color that's a little bit darker and a little bit less water to add some shadows in and add some depth and dimension. Now to step this up with a little bit of stenciling, I'm going in with the tiny circle stencil, which is a new one from my line. I love the smaller scale of these circles because you can use them to color in images like this and add a little bit of texture to it. I'm laying this down on my make art station with my magnets so that it doesn't move around as I'm coloring. Then I can go in with these little detail blending tools. There's some that I love from Altenew and Ranger, and I'm just going to go in with the exact same colors that I used to watercolor it in and add a little bit of shading into those circles. This is just going to add a little bit of texture wherever those dots are and give kind of a cool pattern to it. Now I love these detail blending tools because I didn't have to mask anything off or worry about the color going outside of the lines. These little blending tools are really easy just to kind of maneuver around the edges and keep the color inside of the lines. That's one thing I absolutely love about them. These ones from Altenew are blending brushes, but you can also see for the leaves here that I'm going to go in with these blending tools from Ranger, which are similar to the foam blending tools. They got little pieces of foam on the end, and they're just as easy to control as well. And then when I pull that off, you can see that awesome pattern using the exact same colors that I used to watercolor it in. I think it's just stunning, and something like this just adds a little bit of texture and more depth and dimension to your project. Then to finish off the focal point, I'm going to cut it out. Here I'm using my Fiskars Spring Assist scissors. I absolutely love these because they spring back out at you, so your hands don't get tired as you're cutting. They're a little bit easier to get a smooth cut with, and they're also really easy to get into little details since they got a nice fine point to it. I leave a little bit of a white border when I'm cutting so that it stands out off my project, and I'm going to adhere that to the center of my card. Then I can use a sentiment, and I like to kind of look at the stamp sheet, which one's going to fit the best, and I love the sentiments in this set. They're all so encouraging. I wanted a bold look, so I'm going to go with some white heat embossing on my black cardstock. So I used the anti-static powder bag to make sure no powder is going to stick, and then I'll stamp the sentiment down in some clear sticky ink. I'll throw over a layer of my white heat embossing powder, and then I can heat set that until it turns nice and bright white. This one happens to say thinking of you at this time, which I think is a great encouraging and sympathy sentiment. I added that all together, and I love how that flower stands out at the center of that card. The texture of the flower and the background with that added embossing is so beautiful. Next, I'm going to be showing how to do this same thing but through stencils to add a little bit of texture. So here I'm using this new layering stencil set called Lemon Branch. I absolutely love it. There's 2 stencils in the set and it gives some really beautiful layering. But if I want to add a little bit more texture to it, I can go in with this tiny circle stencil. And I'm going to place it over top. Again, using these magnets in the Make Art Station is really helpful when you're layering stencils. Then I can go in with a little bit of a darker color. Here I'm using Slippery When Wet, and I'm going to blend this on through those dots. This is great through stencils because you don't even have to worry about staying inside the lines because the first stencil will mask it off while the second stencil is adding that texture. Then I'll take off the dot stencil and I'm going to blend a little bit of that darker color on top again to soften things out and make it fit with the rest of the lemons. Then I'll go in with the second layer of the stencil, which happens to be these leaves. They kind of fit into the lemons, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later in today's video. I can add that down with a light color, and then I'll go back through with the dots on top of it and go through one more time. You can use the same color because they're translucent dye-based inks. They're going to build on top of each other. So when I add this stencil down and go through with the same color, because we're building up another layer of it, it'll become a little bit darker. So that's a great way to just use one of the ink pads, but get 2 different shades and add some dimension with the dots. I finished it off with the branch section of the branch to connect everything together, and I love how this stencil looks. I think the texture of the dots on top just give it a little bit more dimension and add kind of a whimsical and playful look to this lemon branch. It's such a fun way to use it. So then I took this and I added it down onto a background. I actually did the embossing technique that I did with the stencil, but this time with a die to get that raised effect. Next, I thought I would share a fun way to kind of shift your stencils. Now this stencil happens to meant to be a shifting stencil. It's called Flip Flop Chevron, and I'm gonna share just a really quick and easy way to use it right here. So here I'm going in with a little bit of my Prom Queen ink and kind of fading it out in the center just for a quick demonstration. With this stencil, you take it and you flip it over onto the back side, and then you line up the chevron pieces right in between. You'll see it fits in perfectly, and then I'm gonna go in with a opposing color. Here I used a little bit of Shooting Star, which is a super bright yellow, and filled in that area. I love the different contrasting colors you can get with this design. You could totally use it just with one layer if you want a little bit more of an open chevron, but I love that you have the option to flip it over and get it in a separate color or medium. Now next I'm going to be showing you how to do this technique but with a different medium instead of just a different color for a little bit of an elevated look. I'm using that Stick and Stamp matte again, and then I can stick down the stencil right over top. I'm using that Flip Flop Chevron stencil again here, and for the first layer I'm going to use a layer of ink again. Here I'm using a minty fresh color from my line. I love the bright mint that this has, but it's a little bit more subdued than some other mints. I think it's a beautiful color. And I'll just go in with my blending brush to blend this in. Then once this is finished, I can go in and lift it off my stick and stamp mat. And you can see we've got a great background there. If you want to leave it, you totally could, but I want to flip it. So you can see all you do is flip it over to the other side of the stencil, and it's going to fill in the other areas right in between the design. It's a pretty easy stencil to kind of flip over and get it lined up pretty perfect. So once that's all stuck down, I can then bring in a little bit of Lunar paste. And this is that same minty fresh color. So I can just go in here and lay this right over top and use a palette knife to kind of spread it into all of the areas of the stencil. I love the Lunar paste because it's got a nice creamy consistency, so it's really easy to apply over stencils with a palette knife and get into all of the details without it going underneath the stencil, which is something I love. Then I'll go over and smooth it over top to make sure it's nice and smooth. And then we can peel off our stencil here. And I just already love the shine that it has. And the shine only intensifies as it dries. Then I can go and clean off my mat quickly. You want to clean off things before they dry with the Lunar paste. For the stick and stamp mat, I just use a little bit of water and a paper towel again. And you can see those clumps come off pretty easily. And the Lunar paste comes off the mat really nicely once it's still wet. And once that mat dries, it'll be nice and sticky, ready to use again. So then to finish off this card, I'm using the Zesty stamp set. That actual lemon branch up there does coordinate with those layering stencils, but I'm not going to be using it in today's video. I'm going to go in with one of the different lemon stamps from the set, and we can stamp it down using a little bit of black ink. And there's also a little leaf that comes in the set that you can kind of layer on top of that lemon or next to it. I'm going to line that up and stamp it down, and then we'll stamp down one of the little lemon slices with it. Then I can go in and do a little bit of heat embossing because I love to add a layer of clear heat embossing powder. I love the shiny look that it gives, and I also like that it adds kind of a more intense black look to the image. Then to fill these in, they have solid images in the stamp set too, so I'm going to go in and really easily stamp that down with a little bit of yellow ink and shade it with a little bit of a darker yellow at the bottom edge. Then once I stamp that down, it gives a really super easy and beautiful colored in effect. I'll do the same thing with a little lemon slice by adding a little bit of shading using a darker yellow color and stamping it down. I love when stamp sets have solid images like this, that it makes it really super easy to color in all of the images in the set. So if you don't love going into watercolor, this is great for you. Then I can go in, and if you have any little mistakes where there are little white areas that you didn't line it up perfectly, you can go in with those detailed blending tools again to fill those in. To give the images a grounding point, I'm going to use a little circle die cut, and I'll just blend on a little bit of that minty fresh ink onto the center so that it coordinates nicely with my background. Once the stencil background's dry, we can add it down onto our card base and adhere it in place, and then I can go in with my stamped sentiment. Here I'm using a sentiment from the set that just says, "You make things look easy peasy lemon squeezy." I love that one, and I'll adhere everything into place then. I love the shiny background and how that gives a little bit of texture and contrast from the ink color, and then how easy those lemons were to color in to create our focal point. Next, I wanted to just share a quick example of two of these techniques together. So first I'm going in with the tiny circle stencil, and you can actually just spread the Lunar paste right through with your finger. So I'm just going right through with a little bit of Psych and blending that over top. This is going to give you a thinner layer with a little bit less texture, but it also dries a lot quicker. So I'm going to heat set this for about 10 to 20 seconds, and it'll be dry then, and you can go in and move on with your next layer. I love how quick the Lunar paste dry time is, especially when you add it down super thin like this. Then I can shift the stencil. So your stencil doesn't always have to be meant for shifting. You can kind of just like shift the dots in between other dots to create a new pattern. And then I'll go in with a little bit of the matching Psych ink. This is going to create that same kind of tone-on-tone background, but one of the layers has that beautiful shine, and it gives you that cool stencil shifting technique. So try shifting your stencil, even if it's not meant for shifting, you can get some beautiful designs. Now for this next card, I'm going to use the lemon branch stencil again. I love how easy this stencil is to layer up, and that you can use it either alone or along with the Zesty stamp set to fill in that branch with detail. Here I'm going to be using it alone again, and I'm starting off with the stick and stamp mat and placing down my card right in the center. I love that it has lines to kind of line it up, and then we can also use it to stick down our stencil as well. For this first layer, I'm just going in with normal ink, a little bit of shooting star, and I'm going to blend that right over top of the stencil to add a little bit of color down. Then I'm going to go in with a little bit of slippery when wet Lunar paste, and I'm just going to go in and add a little bit of texture and shine to this. So I'm using a tiny little blender brush for this, and I'm adding just a little bit of the slippery and wet onto my blender brush. A little bit goes a long way here, and then we can kind of blend this onto the surface. I'm going in the areas where I would usually add a little bit of shading. I'm adding this mica texture paste right there. So you can see I'm kind of adding it on the tops and sides of the lemon to make them a little bit darker in that area. And then to clean out the blending brush when I'm done using it, I'm going to spray it with some water. You can take it under a sink if you want to too, to make sure that it's all out. You want to get it completely clean because it's going to dry crusty if you leave it in there, and that'll ruin your brushes. So then I'm going in with the second layer. This is the leaves, and it's really easy to line up because you can kind of see exactly how they fit into those lemons. And then I can go in with a little bit of overzealous ink for my base layer here. To add a little bit of shading here, I'm going to go in with another color. Here I'm using a little bit of Later Gator just because I wanted to add a little bit of darkness onto those leaves. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading. Then I can go in and lift that off. And this one's even easier because I don't have to be super careful with this next layer. We can move it up and it's going to add a little bit of dimension to some of those leaves. So I'm doing this the same way by taking a little bit of the Lunar paste on my blending brush, and then I'll apply it to the whole layer. Because this layer just has a little bit of those leaves, we can apply the Lunar paste all across the layer, and it's going to give lots of shine to it. Now again, I love this, kind of adding it lightly like this, because the dry time is going to be super quick, but it's still going to have that beautiful, impactful shine on your project. So that's how I can kind of layer this up. Because it dries so fast, it's not going to mess up the layer behind it. Then to finish this off, I'm going to go in with my branch, line that up, and we can blend that in with a little bit of Gur brown ink. I love using blending brushes, especially for small things like these little branches, because it's going to make sure to get into all of the little details with the different bristles on the brushes. That's why I've been loving blending brushes lately for detailed stencils like this. So here's a closer look at all of that amazing shine. I love that we were able to kind of blend it into the yellow there to give it a little bit of shading and a full layer of that Later Gator green, which is so shiny. To finish this off, I'm going in again with those Spring Assist scissors, and again leaving that white border as I cut around it so that it's going to stand out nicely off my card and give it a little bit of dimension. Then for the card base and background, I'm going to use a little bit of prickly pear cardstock and this really awesome pinstripe background stamp. You'll see more about this in the future, but each one of those stripe layers peel apart if you want to use them separately, or you can use them all together like we're doing today. For this one, I'm just using a little bit of Psych ink, inking that up and stamping it down onto my cardstock. Now I like to use this Debbie pressure tool to kind of run it over top of the background stamp to make sure that everything is going to transfer nicely, and there we get that beautiful tone-on-tone effect. I can add the lemon branch down then with a little bit of foam tape for some dimension, and then I can go in with my sentiment. Again, I'm using that kind of backer sheet to make sure that the sentiment is going to line up perfectly, and I liked the sentiment that said, "You're my main squeeze," so that's the one I decided to use. But that's super helpful to be able to use that clear sheet to make sure you know what sentiment's going to fit before you stamp it down. I'll stamp that down in black ink and then clear heat emboss it to make sure it's nice and dark black and it's going to stand out beautifully. Then I'll heat emboss that until it's clear and shiny, and that finishes off that card. The background is kept super simple, but I love the detail of those stripes. And the star of the show is really that lemon branch stencil and bringing in different mediums like that Lunar paste to add texture and shine to your layering stencils. Alright guys, I hope you really enjoyed that video. If you did, please give it a big thumbs up and leave me a comment down below letting me know which of the cards were your favorite. There's also a full supplies list linked down below where you can check out all of the different supplies, and those links help support me, so I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for stopping by and joining me, and I'll see you all very soon for another card making video. Bye!